Thank you all so much for joining us. So I'm Dr. Leah with Bump and Baby, and this is Jessica Gomes. And Jessica's handle on Instagram is at Little Eaters _ SLP. Jessica is a speech language pathologist who's also the mom of a 1-year-old. I'm so excited today to be on with Jessica to talk about baby-led weaning versus purees and also pacifier use. Jessica, what do you focus on for your work?
I said always focused on feeding and swallowing. And so, what was really important for me when I started feeding my little guy to really make sure I was promoting oral motor development. So that kind of guided why I chose to use baby-led feeding or baby-led weaning and go in that direction.
Thank you. You mentioned that you were also influenced by your brother with having special needs. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So my brother was born with pretty severe to profound cerebral palsy. So when he was a little guy, he was primarily tube fed, and just watching him kind of work with therapists to be able to eat orally was pretty amazing. And that kind of also guided me. And also the actual speech language portion of it. So, watching him, trying to learn how to communicate, whether it was through verbal language or other ways. So that kind of always stuck with me and always kind of made me really passionate about going into speech and kind of guided what I decided to do.
Thank you. That's really amazing. So now that you have your own son who's 1-year-old, I'm sure how to start solid foods has been something that you've been thinking about and looking into. So I find that there's like a lot of confusion in general about what baby-led weaning really means. Would you mind just kind of defining that for us?
Yeah, so, the whole gist of baby-led weaning is kind of in the name, right? The baby is leading the way. You're kind of giving them the reins to explore and experiment with food. So you want to make sure they have prerequisite skills before starting. We usually say around 6 months where they have pretty good trunk support. They can sit up on their own with minimal support. They're able to bring, hands to mouth. Those kinds of prerequisite skills are really important. If a baby doesn't have adequate trunk support, you might want to wait for a bit. So again, baby-led weaning is really just letting your baby kind of take control in some way. And we all know babies learn by playing and by engaging with their environment and their surroundings. And that's the same way with going with feeding. They're learning by actually being an active participant in the whole mealtime experience.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like 6 months is kind of like the general recommendation people give for starting solids, but you should be looking out for readiness in your baby, which could happen a little bit before or a little bit after that, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And kind of like I said, we're looking at some of the trunk support, babies able to bring hands to mouth, and also if baby's interested in food, if they're watching you eat and either reaching for your food or they're even doing some lip smacking while watching you eat is also a sign of readiness.
That makes total sense. And like the trunk support and being able to hold their head up, I think that kind of signals that they are ready from like a motor development standpoint to handle eating solids, right?
Absolutely. And, it's really interesting to see, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about it, but, the gag reflex and the tongue thrust reflex, babies are born with all these reflexes, including oral reflexes. So we actually start to see the tongue thrust reflex start to diminish at about 6 months. And we see the gag reflex move further back into the mouth at about 6 months on average as well. So those are, important to keep in mind. A lot of times I feel especially with traditional puree feeding, at about 4 months, you'll see a lot of that tongue thrusting, which is developmentally normal, and why you might not see it as much in a 6 or 7 month old baby.
Oh my gosh, that totally connects the dots for me because when babies are younger, they're not really supposed to have anything go down that's a solid, and that could even be a choking hazard for them. So the tongue thrust reflex is like a safety reflex for them.
It's a protective mechanism, absolutely.
That's great to know. So if you are starting to see these signs that your baby is ready and they're around 6 months old, what kind of foods do you recommend parents starting out with?
So some of the best to start out with, in my opinion, are first off, anytime you're starting baby-led weaning, you're really sticking to, you want to serve food that's about the size and length of 1 to 2 adult fingers. So that's for a couple different reasons. First off, it's a safety thing, bigger, it kind of goes against what we think, but bigger can actually be safer in a lot of ways, especially with babies, right? And it also helps them grasp, right? They don't have that small pincer grasp. So a larger piece of food they can grasp better. I call it the squish test. So I always say you should be able to kind of squish whatever you're giving baby between your 2 fingers. If you're able to squish it between your fingers, baby can definitely use gums. They don't need their teeth to squish it as well. So a few favorites that parents start out with usually are, avocado, banana, baked sweet potatoes. And even I think one of our first foods was oatmeal, which was a more puree consistency, but we presented it on a preloaded spoon. So I scooped it for him and handed it over and let him go to town.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And that's like you brought up one of the things that I think is really important with baby-led weaning is letting them choose when they want to take that bite and how much they want to take of it. So even if you preload a spoon, that still counts as baby-led weaning, right?
Exactly. Because again, baby is in charge. Baby's deciding if he's putting it in his mouth or if he's going to throw it, which will certainly happen, or if he's going to take it off the spoon with his hands. You're still offering it. And it also is really good, not only for that, but oral motor development and the whole idea of, being able to use a spoon or use a cup. So it kind of lays those foundational skills as well.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard a lot of kind of confusion, like, can you still give your baby purees at all if you're doing baby-led weaning?
Absolutely. We actually started a little bit before 6 months in our situation. And what I actually did for our first couple of foods was I would present both actually. And we had a little bit of a weight concern issue. So I wanted him to be getting a little bit extra, which was the reason on our behalf why we did it. But so, for example, he started solids around Thanksgiving time. So for Thanksgiving, I gave him big old pieces of turkey, which he picked up and he gnawed and sucked on. They're usually not eating much from these big pieces. And then I actually also pureed some pieces of turkey and offered on a preloaded spoon. So you can absolutely do both. And I also think it's important to be offering these naturally like puree consistencies. So yogurts, oatmeals, applesauces, because we want baby to become familiar with how to manipulate and manage multiple textures, not just solid. We want them to know what lumpy feels like and how to manage that and how to manage, that more smooth puree consistency as well. I think it's actually important that you are offering some sort of purees, whether it's a natural puree like a yogurt, or if you're pureeing and offering it alongside with solid pieces of food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm Chinese American, and one of the foods that we always eat is rice porridge. And it's also one of the first foods that we start babies with. Of course, now that's all controversial because the heavy metals in rice issue. But as an adult, I still eat rice porridge all the time. So it makes total sense to me that like babies should learn how to handle purees as well as more solid
Absolutely.
textures.
And you made a really good point. One of the other ideas behind baby-led weaning is to really promote this idea of mealtime and eating with your babies, which is kind of hard to do in today's society a lot of time, but really trying to make time for at least one meal a day where you're sitting down eating with your baby and making it into a social engagement. And so babies are mirrors. They're going to kind of mirror everything you do. So if they see mom and dad eating, whatever it may be, they're going to be more inclined to eat it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to bring up something that is really scary for parents is like gagging. So I know that gagging is very common. It's probably going to happen at some point to all babies, even if you're taking every precaution. Can you talk a little bit about how gagging is different from choking?
Absolutely. And I think this is the big thing. I actually recommend often that parents actually watch videos of babies gagging if you're going to start, even if you don't decide to do baby-led weaning, and just getting comfortable with what gagging looks like, but also to differentiate the difference between gagging and choking, like you said. So they are very different. I kind of have a little saying, read and loud let them kind of go ahead. If they're quiet and blue, then they need help from you. So if you're seeing a gag, you're probably hearing an audible kind of gagging noise. You're going to hear coughing. A lot of times baby might go red, and that's okay. The worst thing you can do in that situation is lunge towards baby or try to put your hand in baby's mouth, because what you could potentially do is cause a really harmless gag to push the food back and potentially end up in a choke. Choking, like I said, baby's going to be pretty silent, right? Choking is when their airway is occluded, so they have a complete blockage or a partial blockage in the airway. So they're not going to be making many sounds. They could potentially be going blue, and then that's when you need to intervene. And I think any parent, regardless if you're doing traditional purees or baby-led weaning, I think it's really important that you are up to date on your CPR and infant choking sequence and first aid. Because yeah, choking can happen with food, and it certainly does. But how many times do we hear stories of baby crawling on the floor and they find a little piece of something and they put it in their mouth and choke on it? So I think being able to confidently help you, have the skills to confidently help your baby if, God forbid, that is the situation you're in. And I want to point out, like we've kind of talked about before, the gag reflex is a protective mechanism that babies are born with. And babies are born with their gag reflex much more forward in their mouth than adults. And as they get older and with more experience with food and different things, their gag reflex goes back a little bit more. And it's kind of interesting when you look at it, and we talk about reflexes being protective mechanisms. When a baby's gagging, or when anyone's gagging, the back of the tongue is elevating up to kind of block anything from going back. And then you're seeing that tongue thrust, so the tongue is moving forward to push whatever's in the mouth out. It is definitely scary, even though I'm a SLP and I work in the field all the time. When my little one gags, it's like, just stay calm. And I always tell parents, from the beginning, coach them on how to spit out. If you see baby gagging, teach them, okay, that's a lot of food, spit out, and imitate, what spitting out would look like. And once in a while, my almost 1-year-old does still on occasion gag, and I look at him, I go, spit out, and he spits it right out. So, it's a good skill to have.
Yeah. So it sounds like gagging is a normal reflex to protect your airway, and your baby will not be turning blue. You're going to see them gagging. They're going to be making sounds, and you don't need to intervene.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then choking is when the airway is actually blocked off, and that is an emergency, and you do need to intervene. And baby CPR, I totally agree with you. Like, as a physician, I think every parent who has an infant should know how to do infant CPR as well.
Absolutely. And that goes for caregivers. I know my mom watches my son twice a week, and I was like, you need to go update your infant CPR and first aid, because she's going to be with him, and you want to make sure that everyone, God forbid, if you're in that situation, you know what to do. And just in terms of safety in general, especially when first starting out, you always want to make sure you have eyes on baby when they're eating, provide that you're providing that supervision, but also seating. We want babies to be sitting in a high chair, their trunk at a 90-degree angle. And then you want their legs and their knees at a 90-degree angle with some sort of rest for their foot. And that also helps promote trunk support. So that's important to keep in mind as well.
Yeah. I had this terrifying moment where I thought I was going to kill my baby with a green bean. What I didn't realize, I wish I had done more research into this, is the types of foods that are more likely to cause choking. And green beans, because they're stringy and long, they can get stuck in there. And I saw her gagging, and it was like you said, very scary. So I was wondering if you could talk about textures of foods that are a little bit more high risk for choking, and when is it okay to use them, and when should you hold off on them?
So with everything, it's going to vary child to child, but overall, especially when first starting out, you want to avoid raw veggies. So you want to make sure everything you're giving, again, you can squish between your fingers. Like you said, those longer, stringier consistencies can be challenging. Rice actually can be challenging, and you would think not, because it's so small, but just plain rice on its own can kind of separate in the mouth, right? If it's not being held by something cohesive to hold it together, and baby might have a hard time managing. So rice can actually be considered a choking for really, really little guys. your usual candies, any sort of hard candies, obviously can be choking, not that you necessarily give that to a baby. Pretzels can be considered a high-risk choking food, as well as popcorn's actually a biggie. And then hot dogs, all those other kind of things that we think about, which you wouldn't particularly give to a baby, but it is good to be aware. And some raw fruit, you wouldn't give a baby just a raw apple. I would recommend, making sure you're cooking it again so it's soft, or you're baking it. And again, the rule is about 3 to 4 where raw veggies and raw fruits are deemed okay. But I've seen babies with very adequate oral motor skills who have been eating challenging consistencies, and they can handle really thin sliced apples and things like that. So it all depends on the child and what they're used to and what they've been exposed to as well.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. What's your take on peanut butter? Because I read that that's a choking hazard, but I've also read that peanut butter is really good to introduce early, because the earlier you introduce it, the less likely they are to get a peanut allergy later.
Yeah, so one of the other things I really like with baby-led weaning is it does promote reduced picky eating with older kids, and it does seem to reduce allergies. So babies being allergic to different type of foods, like you said, nuts, fish, all those things. So with peanut butter, I think it's so important to introduce, but you can definitely introduce it in safe ways. So, I actually add peanut butter to oatmeal often, and that's one way. You can water it down and put it on toast fingers is another good way. There's certain peanut butter puff kind of brands that are fairly, have no added sugar and very little salt that some parents like to try to use to introduce peanut butter. So there are ways around it. Even nuts, you wouldn't think, obviously, I'm not going to give my baby a walnut. That's just crazy. But there are ways, I've grinded up walnuts really, really, really fine and sprinkled them on yogurt or sprinkled it on fruit. And he's still getting that exposure, but in a safe way.
Oh, that's a great idea. Yeah. Oh, I like that a lot. The pulverized walnut dust, but they're still getting that exposure and training their immune system to not overreact to it.
Absolutely. And you can modify pretty much any food out there to make it safe for baby. My little guy has had well over 100 different foods, from everything you can think of, from sardines to cabbage to peanut butter, and so there are ways around it. You just might have to think a little bit outside the box.
Yeah, that brings me to a question about meat. So there are, of course, moms who choose to raise their children vegetarian or vegan, but let's say you do want to introduce meat and fish to your child. I find that really challenging. My baby naturally gravitates towards sweet things like fruit. Like she'll eat raspberries, things like that all day. But when I try to get her to eat a piece of chicken, she really doesn't do it. Do you have any tips on how to introduce meat and fish to your baby?
Yeah, so I think the earlier the better. As along with what you're introducing everything else, there's no reason to hold off on introducing meat or fish. They can be definitely one of the first foods you're introducing. And exposure, I talk a lot about the importance of exposure, and just the idea that, research has shown that it takes, at least 20 exposures before someone can say they truly don't like something, especially with babies. We really want to work on diversifying the palate. So giving them, even if they don't eat it, baby-led weaning, your baby might not eat very much to start. They might just be playing with it, and that's completely fine. We're letting them lead the way on it. So even if they're not eating the meat and they're still interacting with it, they're still touching it, they're maybe even just bringing it to their mouth. That's all really good steps, and just exposure, exposure, exposure. The more you can expose the baby, the better.
Okay. So appropriate textures, the sizing, and just keep offering to them until they gradually.
My little guy, he was just not really a fan of asparagus. It was one of the only foods he was like, not so crazy about. And I offered it probably once or twice a week, and eventually he was like, oh, okay, yeah, I like it. And to go with that, seasoning, right? We don't really like to eat bland food. So season your baby's food. The only thing you need to be careful of is sodium. So from the beginning, I've cooked for the baby the same way I cook for myself and just hold off on the salt and then add the salt for my tasting once I take his food out. So,
Okay.
make sure, season your baby's food. Their digestive system by 6 months is mature enough to handle, obviously don't give them anything, don't give them a jalapeno, but you can use garlic and onion and all that good stuff.
That's great. So I did a lot of pouches for my baby because we were constantly on the go, and the idea of because baby led feeding does take a long time for them to eat.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we would just be on the go. So I would just pack pouches for her and we would eat it at the park or, at her like sign language class or whatever. So how bad are food pouches? Like, are they ever okay?
I don't think anything is bad. I don't think there's any food that's bad or anything that's bad. I think the problem we run into is when it's overly used. So if you're using a food pouch once in a while, no big deal. The issue with food pouches is it's really promoting that suckle pattern. So it's promoting a low resting forward tongue for that suck instead of a more mature swallow pattern that we would want to see. So again, once in a while isn't going to do any harm, but if you're using pouches daily, that might be when I would be like, maybe hold off. I know they actually sell a better option is they sell like the little spoons you can attach onto the pouch. So they're not really sucking there. It's more of a spoon feed, which can help promote a little bit more of a mature swallow pattern.
Oh, that's
An
interesting.
alternative. Yeah, I mean, again, if you're once in a while on the go, they're definitely easy. So I don't think there's any harm in it. But if you're using, you find yourself relying them on daily, maybe try a spoon attachment so it's more of a natural. It's not really supernatural for us to be sucking food out, right? So using a spoon is a more natural way to promote it.
Yeah, maybe it's kind of like drinking smoothies as an adult. Like when I'm in a rush, I'll drink a smoothie as a meal,
Exactly.
but I definitely wouldn't be on a full liquid diet just drinking smoothies all the time.
Exactly. And there's nothing wrong once in a while, but once it becomes a daily thing, it could, be a little bit of a, maybe not.
Okay. And what's your take on pacifier use? So I've read like there have been several studies saying that children or babies who sleep with the pacifier are less likely to get SIDS. So that's really positive. And it also appears to it really does soothe babies. It helps them feel safe and secure during painful procedures. They seem to have less, arousal of their nervous system if they are allowed to suck on something. So on the one hand, it's like you're giving them something that's a comfort to them and then possibly also decreasing their risk of SIDS while they're sleeping. But I've also read that if you use it too much, it can cause malformations of the jaw and possibly speech delay. What's your take on that?
So kind of with the food pouches, I don't think pacifiers are inherently bad. I think once again, the problem happens when there's prolonged use of a pacifier or overuse of the pacifier. So yes, lots of studies show that, use of pacifiers is correlated to reduced rate of SIDS. But then again, that being said, the cases of SIDS happen before 6 months, about 90% of the time. 90% of cases happen before 6 months. So once you're hitting 6 months a year, we can start exploring maybe baby doesn't need pacifier so much. And the soothing aspect, I'm completely in agreement, right? We know babies are sucking before they're even born. Like we've all seen ultrasound pictures of babies sucking their thumb in the womb, right? It's a really, really natural, soothing reflex for babies. And you think about these poor little guys who are being born into this loud, noisy, cold world when they've been in this dark, quiet space for so long. It does provide that kind of input that they're really seeking, and it does calm them down. But again, as babies mature, they don't really need that as much. So, you might find different recommendations out there, but I like to say, about 4 to 6 months, I think you can start minimizing pacifier use to sleeping, right? So nap times and overnight, then pacifier is fine. But even as newborns, I sometimes see pacifier being the immediate response to give to a crying baby. And so I would challenge parents to maybe, explore other options, cuddling, baby wearing is huge, providing them that kind of safety feeling that they might be wanting. So I do encourage parents to try other means before just grabbing the pacifier and putting it in. Even as newborns, we can try to explore different things. And then once hitting 4 to 6 months, minimizing pacifier use to nap times and overnights, and then eventual completely off the pacifier, including for sleep. I personally recommend 18 months to 2 years. There's some different recommendations out there, but I think that's more than appropriate. And like you said, when we run into problems when there's overuse. So I think we've all seen, little guys, maybe they're 1, 2 years old, walking around the pacifier in all day. So the couple things can happen, like you kind of mentioned, we have dental issues, we have malformations of the jaw and the palate, which can actually change the face structure of a baby or child's face. And can also lead to speech problems, because if their teeth are not coming in right, or there's this malformation of the face, you're going to have difficulty with certain speech sounds. A lot of times you associate maybe a tongue thrust or a lisp with might be one of the problems that might arise. The other issue is there's been a huge correlation with frequent pacifier use and actual frequent ear infections. And with ear infections, you can get a buildup of fluid in the ear, which can potentially lead to a temporary hearing loss, which again can then impact speech and language as well. And again, there's not too much research at this showing the correlation of language delay and pacifier use, but in my experience, and it's kind of common sense, right? If you're walking around the pacifier in your mouth all day, you're probably not going to be talking so much, right? Because it's kind of hard. If you and I put a pacifier in our mouth right now, it's hard. You're not going to do it. And I have parents that I've worked with who they've weaned off the pacifier and like, oh my God, my kid's talking so much now. Yeah. And it's because now they have this opportunity, babies and kids learn language through these reciprocal interactions. So if they're walking around the pacifier all day, you might not even be talking to them as much because they're not engaging on that back and forth speech interaction. So
yeah, just in our own family, I noticed like right around a year is when she started making a lot more sound, like language-like sounds. So my daughter was a little bit delayed in actually like speaking, like expressive language ability, but we took her to an SLP, and like apparently it's normal for bilingual kids, like they say stuff later. But that was when I was like, oh, she's making so many sounds. We do need to get the pacifier out at least during the daytime, because then it's that opportunity cost. She's not getting the chance to make those sounds. Because she would never like take it out and make a sound and put it back in. That's like
exactly
way too much trouble.
That's also why I like around 6 months, because around 6 months you see a big jump in babbling. So you do start to see more babbling at around 6 months. And so that's why I tend to like recommending not taking up the pacifier away, but maybe minimizing it to sleep. And, if baby's really inconsolable and that's the only thing that will console them, or I know my little guy hates the car seat. So we even still sometimes use the pacifier in the car because it's a screaming match. So there are, areas where it's completely fine. As long as there's a balance, like with everything else, there's nothing that's inherently bad, I don't believe. And I think it just all comes down to balancing it out.
I love how you take such like a kind of middle way approach to everything. I think that's really sane.
It is. And no two parents are alike, and no two families are alike. And we all need to do the best we can. And what works for one family might not work for another family. And we need to all, keep that in mind and just try to balance things out. I think is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I wanted to open it up in the last few minutes. Does anybody in the live audience have any questions for Jessica?
My name is Anna, and I do have a question. I was wondering if there's any books you would recommend on baby-led weaning. I know there's an Instagram that I've started following, but I don't know if there's any books.
There are a lot of books out there. I don't have one that I kind of recommend as like a holy grail. There are certain sites. There's one site, Solid Starts, I believe it is. And the really nice thing about Solid Starts is it has a whole food database. So you can essentially type in like any food, and it'll give you, how healthy it is and how to prepare it for baby, and even some recipe ideas. So I tend to recommend that as a resource. I think that's helpful, especially when we're kind of on the go and just need a quick, like, oh, how do I serve beets to my baby? You know, you can type in beets and they'll give you some options. But I don't have a particular book that I specifically recommend, but I know there are many great ones out there.
What's the name of that site one more time?
Solid Starts, I believe.
Solid Starts. Okay.
Solid Starts. Yeah, I believe they have an Instagram account and they have an actual website and has a lot of good information on it. So it might be a good resource to start with.
Thank you. Any other questions out there?
This is Anna again. I have one more. CPR first aid certification. Would you go through Red Cross? I was certified years ago, but it's expired. And I did take Legacy's class that just kind of gives you the points and tips, and so did my husband, but I was actually wondering about pursuing certification.
Yep, you could. I know Red Cross is kind of the big one. It's typically how I renew my certifications, and it's typically what I recommend. But I know there are some other ones out there that I think are fine. But yes, the Red Cross is what I typically would recommend going through.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. So I'm Dr. Leah with Bump and Baby, and this is Jessica Gomes. And Jessica's handle on Instagram is @littleeaters_SLP. So make sure you follow her. And do you have a website as well, Jessica?
It's currently under construction, so I am working on it and hopefully we'll have it up and running. I do have some exciting stuff in the works in terms of, some e-guides on how to start baby-led weaning and some resources on where to go if you're stuck. I talk a lot on my Instagram page about oral motor development and the importance of that throughout, with everything from pacifiers to straw drinking, cup drinking. So I think I definitely have some good information that might be helpful. And if I don't have an answer for you, I can hopefully guide you in the right direction.
Thank you. That's wonderful. So once again, Jessica Gomes @littleeaters_SLP on Instagram. I follow her personally, and I think that she has so much great information out there. And we didn't even cover cup drinking, sippy cups, straw drinking, any of those things.
Hours.
Yeah, so you got to go to her Instagram and follow her to find that information. And I will definitely be keeping an eye out for your ebook offerings. I'm really excited about that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me. This was great.